Siguli swagwag, Galahindi Neogets, Wagi Sliwagi Niwa Kitaloda, Onidag, and Wenege, Ani Bojo, Dante, Okinapi, How, Yonko, Yukodolas. So, for those of you who arrived late, I just introduced myself. I always introduce myself in my original language, so I said, hello everyone. Galahindi is my name. It's colonial language means clouds passing over. And I'm on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Delaware, and Huron nations here in the northern part of Turtle Island, in an area that we call the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Treaty Territory. So it's a treaty that actually predates the arrival of settlers. So it's the longest running treaty on this land, and one that's actually recognized and adhered to. It was made amongst the indigenous peoples in this area, so that we could share the resources on the earth, Mother Earth, and so the agreement was to not take anything more than what we actually needed, as far as medicines and foods, plants, and that sort of thing, to ensure that we're a sustainable society. Now, we are a couple of minutes from um, this event, which is supposed to be starting in like 1 minute. I'm just waiting for them to actually start letting us in. I've logged into the Zoom and meeting, and so we're just kind of waiting for them to push the button and get things started. So, this is a webinar called Building Bridges, Responding to the Misconceptions of Transgender People. It's only going to be about an hour long, and then we'll get back to the music after that. So basically, the 2SLGBTQIA plus community and Two Spirits members and advocates say that the past year has been really difficult and scary amid notable rise in hate crimes, threats, and protests, particularly for those who are transgender and non binary. So the solution, we believe, is going to be education and support from allies to counter the homophobia and anti-trans hate. Very much along the same um, methodologies that are required by the indigenous peoples of North America in relation to trying to get rights and our movements pushed forward. So
Recording in progress.
here we go.
We have more than 400 people signed up for this webinar. Isn't that fantastic, Kai?
That's amazing. I'm really excited to hear that.
It's so great. It's so good. A lot of people are interested. They were very keen. I got a lot of messages from people saying, I really want to be there. I can't join at the time. Hopefully next time. But a lot of people are really interested, which is really fantastic. So maybe a few more seconds. Everyone, if you can just use the chat, say hi, let us know where you are calling from. That would be great. Red Deer, hi Lisa. Melissa's here. Calgary, Armstrong. Calgary, Vancouver, Toronto, Maple Ridge, Saskatchewan. It's just like the list is just moving really fast. Great, fantastic. Great to have you here all. I think we can start. Everyone, my name is Wael Baween. I am a partner here at the Charex. It's very nice to have you all here. These webinars are so close to my heart. We do them for the community. We do them for free. We do them because we want to connect with you and chat with you and hear from you and learn together. And also, it's a really great opportunity. I can connect with friends and people I totally respect and I admire and I learn from. And Kai is one of them. And I have been really excited about having Kai here. Part of this really important discussion today. So Great to have you all here. Our webinar today is Building Bridges, just responding to misconceptions of transgender people. We will learn about transgender identity. We'll learn about, some terminology. We'll learn about background. We'll learn about information that give us more context. And then we'll talk about misconceptions and things we can do to make our environments, our communities, our workplaces better for people who identify as transgender. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge where I am here. I'm talking to you from the land of the Coast Salish people, the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. I'm here in Vancouver. It's a cloudy, very cold day, but it's not raining. I feel really fortunate to be here, and I feel really, really fortunate to building all these connections. I'm a person who came to this land. I wasn't born here. I just came to this place, and I am now living here, working here. I have my family, I have my friends, I have my work, and I always think about my responsibility as an individual, and as a person, and as a as a friend, and as a colleague, and as a father to this land and this community, and what I should do, and what's my responsibility. I want you all to reflect on that. All this conversation is about the land and people of the land, the history of the land, how some of us face barriers and some of us don't. Some of us have, power and opportunity, and as allies, we need to use that to remove these barriers and just make all these places around us better, really better. I will hear some information today. I was going through this with Kai, and I'm like, some of this information really makes you think, okay, there's a lot of work that we need to do as collective. So that's why I have you all here. This is our community, all of you here. As I said just at the beginning, we have more than 400 people signed up for this session. Wonderful, wonderful people. So let's all navigate that, reflect on that, and think about our role in removing these barriers. I am part of HRX. HRX is a firm that does a lot of work around equity, diversity, and inclusion. We do training, we do consulting, we do data analytics, we do surveys. We have a lot of things that we do and offer. We have great partners. Many of you, I see the names, and I'm like, yes, great to have you here. But maybe some of you are new to us. Please check our website. We have this really new inclusivity webinar series that we are just launching. So let me use annotate here. So we are offering a few topics as part of this series. So basically, if your organization wants to just plan for 2024, there are multiple events and opportunities for us to learn together about Black History Month, International Women's Day, celebrating diversity, accessibility, Pride Month, Indigenous people, truth and reconciliation. So you can book that in advance. Just use this QR code and just message us, connect with us. We'll give you more information. You can sign up. It's 60-minute webinars. You can, tailor them to your organization. It's really great opportunity to just plan for that ahead versus, I think me and Kai, we know people come just before Pride Month or Indigenous National Day, and they're like, oh, we need this and we need that. And I just think that's not very thoughtful, really. I think we need to be more thoughtful, more proactive, and more, just like show a little bit more care. So that's why we are offering these inclusivity webinars. So think about that. Signed up. I'm trying to convince Kai to be part of them, but we'll see how that goes. The other thing I want to share with you all here is we have another webinar. It's about inclusive holidays. It's happening on December 6th. So please use the QR code also to sign up. It's Shalima, my partner, is leading the webinar, and then also my good friend Sarah is the expert who will be talking about inclusive holidays, how to plan for them, how to offer them, how to really change the way we think about holidays and time off in a way that's inclusive. So that's what I have today. This is for later. And now I'm gonna stop and allow my friend Kai to take over. But before I hand it over to Kai, I want to say a few things. Kai will walk through some, housekeeping things. The Q&A is open, so if you have questions, use the Q&A. The chat is open if you want to chat. Let's all make sure it's respectful, and just engaging in a way that we're supporting each other. Use the Q&A, and I'll be pausing from time to time. I'll ask Kai to pause so we can go through your Q&A questions. So that's one thing. Number two, Kai is a friend I've known for years now, and I totally respect. I learned a lot from Kai. I let Kai just mentored me and guide me and coach me and supported me through this journey. I learned a lot. The expertise Kai brings to this topic, but also to data and assessments and consulting. And Transfocus is a fantastic organization. If there is any opportunity for you to engage with Transfocus, they do a lot of good work, and Kai will talk about that. But I just really glad to have you, Kai, here, and thank you so much for doing this.
Oh my gosh. Well, thank you so much for that warm welcome. It's really exciting to be here with you all today to talk about this very timely topic. And yeah, thank you for setting that up in such a thoughtful way. You really model how we can step into this work in a thoughtful, considerate, deliberate sort of way. So yeah, thank you so much for all of that. And yeah, just wanted to introduce myself a little bit more. My name is Kai Scott, and I use the pronouns he and him. I have kind of a few different things at play in terms of having a professional capacity, which well mentioned, but then also a personal touch point on the topic of gender diversity or trans and non-binary folks. So professionally, I'm a social scientist. If there are any data nerds out there, I'm one of you. we're a family in terms of our love for data and just having that rich understanding about the issues, whether it's about gender diversity or equity, diversity, and inclusion issues more broadly. I assess complex social issues over my 15-year career. I've been doing that more recently with gender diversity last 7 years. Before that, I was actually in the mining industry, doing social impact assessments, and was very honored to work very closely with Indigenous groups and Indigenous nations across Turtle Island. And so I come to you with this professional capacity, but I also have a lived experience, both on two fronts. I usually don't mention the second front, but given the community we have here, I'll go a little bit further into the second piece. But I am a transgender man, so that means I'm a man in terms of my gender identity, and I was female assigned at birth in terms of my sex. And we'll give a very brief overview of terms and concepts, but I just wanted to put myself within this much larger tapestry of gendered experiences. So that's my personal experience, but I also have a kind of complex family situation that has also informed my understanding of how I navigate talking about gender diversity. And it's fairly nuanced that allows for people to have a better understanding if they wish, but also appreciating that some people will not want to come with on this journey. And we'll talk about that in some slides to come. But I just wanted to provide that context for how I come to that understanding and that approach. Before we get going, I did want to acknowledge, since it happened just yesterday, and perhaps some of you have already gone to various commemorations, it was the Trans Day of Remembrance, which started in the 1990s. Sadly, we lose way too many people through transphobic violence or death, murder of people. This has been the case for a long time, but there was the need to organize as a community to come together to grieve the people we lose who have departed far too soon. This impacts not just trans people generally, but there's a specific set of people that this impacts. In particular, Black trans women get killed at disproportionate rates that are alarming, frankly. And we come together to grieve our losses as a way to motivate ourselves to continue to do the work that so desperately needs to be done. And sadly, this year we lost 25 people that we know of. Of course, it's likely much more than that. And sadly, they're not recognized even in their death by family or by press or police. So a large number of them are misgendered or misunderstood. So there's a lot still that we need to do, and this is really important kind of reflection point for us to start the session with. So what are we wanting to cover here today? I mentioned a brief set of terms and concepts. We won't go too far into it because we want to have enough time to set the context and then give just a spotlight on the everyday challenges that folks face and what we can do to help everyday interventions that folks can do as a way to wrap up. In the challenges, we'll talk about the recent rise in anti-trans hate or challenges that have presented themselves and why that's happened. Because I think a lot of people have seen it, but are just not knowing how this has happened and why. So we'll provide shed a little insight into that. Housekeeping, which was already mentioned, we've got some anonymous polls that will keep engaged with one another. And if you have questions, please submit them via Zoom so that we can fold them into the conversation. In a bit, you'll get the access code and you basically type in menti.com into a browser, and then we'll give you the access code to get to the polls. I did want to recognize for anybody who themselves is trans or has loved ones, either family or friends that are trans, that this will likely or could be a difficult topic for you to listen to. Of course, you experience these things day to day, but it's another thing to see them reflected on a page or in a PowerPoint. So if you do find yourself kind of having a difficult time, I just invite you to take care of yourself, that you don't have to kind of power through something, that, if you need to step out, get a glass of water, take some fresh air, please do so, because it's really important that we be able to stay this the long term. And so I just wanted to point that out. For those of you for whom this is a new topic, this is perhaps the first time or one of the few times that you've had to kind of a focused look on this topic, you may be feeling hesitant, nervous, anxious. These are some of the common refrains we hear when people start on this journey. And so I just wanted to say, if this is the case for you, you're absolutely in the right place. We're here to help you with your learning journey. And I invite you to kind of lean into the content, even if it maybe feels a little awkward or maybe you don't know quite how to phrase a question. I'd say, don't worry about it. We'll figure it out together. So really invite the questions so that we can, solve these things together. So I always like to start with a bit of an icebreaker. So this is our first poll question, which will start us to get into, if it's not your experience, what it might be like for others to treat you in the way that some or many trans and non-binary folks face. And in order to do that, oftentimes people think about being another gender, but actually it's about being your own gender as you are now and what it would feel like for others not to see that or not to understand that. And so here's a question to kind of get you thinking about what that might be like if it's not your own experience. And what would you do if everyone didn't assume you were another gender or kind of insisted that you were another gender? And we've got a range of different responses from anger to anxiety, frustration, confusion. Maybe for some of you, there's an indifference. And perhaps some of you would believe at first and then later on be like, hey, wait a second. No, that's not true. And there might be some responses that are not represented here. So we'll just give you a few seconds to think about that, what that would be like, or what it is like, if that's your experience. And really important to note is that we do have a range of responses. There's not just one way that people react. It could change over time as well. Perhaps it's anger at first, and then it goes to frustration, and then later on indifference. So it's not just a kind of a thing of stasis. It really can evolve or change over time. And certainly the one response that I see nobody is selected, but I just wanted to pinpoint is that for many trans people, they can initially believe somebody, especially in their youth, especially if everybody around them, they just maybe don't have enough internal wherewithal or ability to say no. And so as a result, they may actually believe at first what everybody is insisting on, and then later on have to unpack that and figure it out for themselves. So this is good touch point for us to think about before we go into the next few sections. So thank you for participating in this initial poll just to get us started here. So just wanted to lay a few key terms. We won't spend a lot of time here, but I did want to kind of set the stage in case some people are unfamiliar with them. To start, we have 3 concepts, and then the next slide, we have a few key terms. So the first one is sex at birth, and that's related to our anatomy. It's our sex characteristics, hormones, chromosomes. It's usually assigned by a healthcare professional as either female or male. Now, that's not the whole range. There's more than just female and male, even if probably a lot of people don't know about that. It does exist along a spectrum. There are intersex folks that are neither female nor male in terms of their characteristics. So we can already start to see how if we just have a notion that there's 2 of something, that it may not tell us everything, all the diversity that does exist. Similarly, with gender identity, that's our internal, deeply felt sense of our gender. That also exists along a spectrum, boys and girls, men and women. Also, there are folks who are non-binary, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. And last concept is gender expression. So if sex and gender identity are more internal matters, gender expression is more external. It's usually what we see first about somebody, type of clothing they're wearing, perhaps accessories, even mannerisms. That is along a spectrum of feminine, masculine, or androgynous. So with all 3, we may only have really thought about or talked about 2, but there's actually a range for each one of them. So based on those concepts, we now are able to talk about some terms. The first one is cisgender, or cis for short. And basically that's anybody whose sex at birth is different or the same as their gender identity. So people, basically another way to say it is that what people thought their gender was based on their body at birth was correct. And so some people, they get a little nervous. They wonder, well, why do we need to have a term cisgender? Isn't it just everybody else except for trans people? And we don't always need to use it, but it is useful when we're trying to have respectful conversations if there's a difference between trans people and those who aren't. And sometimes people don't have cis at the ready, and they'll say things, and this has happened to me. Again, people didn't intend any harm, but they said to me, there's trans men and then there's real men. And you can see by using real, unfortunately, they've cast judgment unintentionally, more often than not, on trans people. And so better is to say trans men and cis men. And it's okay to talk about differences. It's just how you do that. That's important. There's also, transgender, which now that you know cisgender, you can likely guess. So it's the difference between sex and gender. And essentially, it's quite a broad umbrella under which there's many different gender experiences. Trans women, for example, are people who their gender identity are women and were male assigned at birth in terms of their sex. Also, trans men are already defined for myself. So are men in terms of the gender identity and female assigned at birth in terms of their sex. Anytime you use trans together with some other word, because it's an adjective, you want to combine it with a gender identity, not their sex at birth. I think sometimes people get a little confused and they'll say things like, they'll be talking to me and they'll say, you're a trans female, when actually they meant a trans man because they were focusing on sex. But for trans people, gender identity is the most important part. And for the most part, they don't really want to talk about sex at birth, generally. So there's also non-binary folks. Those are people who are neither men nor women, boys or girls, depending on the age. And there's also folks who, for Indigenous people only, is two-spirit, which can span both gender diversity and or sexual diversity. It depends on the individual. but that's more focused on spiritual and cultural roles, sadly, that were tragically lost through colonization, driven underground, or completely eliminated from nations. And so part of their objectives are to reclaim those old rights and responsibilities. Also important to note is that not everybody uses Two-Spirit. They may have a nation-specific term that they use instead, or perhaps in combination with Two-Spirit. And all of these are adjectives, so you want to combine them with a noun. So they're just not just on their own. You don't say two cisgenders walk down the street. Two cis people, two cis women, and so forth. Many people are curious how many trans people there are. And the statistic we have, which likely is an underestimation, but it gets us at least in the ballpark of how many there are. And we know from the last census, where specific questions were asked, that there are 1 in 300 as the national average across Canada. But of course, that does vary by age and geography. So say, for example, in British Columbia, that average is a bit higher. And among younger ages, it tends to be a bit larger. So putting all that together, we have a bit of a visual that shows us these are distinct from one another in terms of sex, gender, identity, and expression. They are along a spectrum. There's not just two of each, but we have very strong societal expectations that people line up on one side or the other of this, and not much room for people in the middle or people who are crisscrossing the visual. I have a few other things that I'll share. I'll show my own dots as a way to illustrate some of these. So I'm a man, as I mentioned. I was female assigned at birth in terms of my sex. And the combination of those two make me transgender because they're not aligned. And then a little bit surprising for some folks is that my gender expression is more feminine. That shows up in floral prints that I wear. I'm more nurturing in terms of my personality. And also, I tend to be really expressive in my hand gesturing and so forth. And what I'll say is that based on knowing one or two pieces of information, sometimes we fill out the rest of the spectrum for others rather than making space for them to be able to share that more directly. In particular, people assume that I'm a gay man, which I'm always honored to be thought of as such because I have many lovely gay men in my life. However, that's not accurate for my experience in that I'm a bisexual man. So you can see how we start to try to fill things in. I'll just say
Question?
that, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so this is fantastic. I see a lot of reactions and people commenting on this. This is really wonderful graph and visual for us to navigate. One question said, if a person is intersex, does that mean that they are trans?
Mm-hmm. Great question. And those are separate matters. So there could be instances where somebody is both intersex and transgender, but they are separate. One is related to somebody's sex, so their anatomy in terms of what they were either born with or develop later on in puberty. And transgender is about the difference in one's gender identity compared to one's sex at birth. So intersex folks, while there's a bit of overlap in the issues, especially within healthcare, they are separate matters that have their own distinct issues involved in them. But I do want to recognize that there are intersex trans people, so they're both at the same time.
Another question. So I'll try to reflect on this myself and encourage you all who are listening to us to do the same. So I was assigned as male. I am a man. That's how I identify my gender. My gender expression, is this what people think of me or like who makes this?
This is
Who
a very
decides this?
interesting one. There's aspects to it, right? There's what people read on the outside
Okay.
based on looking at somebody, but there's also like what you authentically show up as well. So it really depends. I would say put on what your authentic is, and then you could see I've shifted mine because in mining sites I shift my expression to be more masculine so I can be safe, right? So that's how people are reading me. So it's more complex there. Yeah.
Interesting. My last question, what is the sexual orientation here?
Yes. So there is another spectrum you could add down below. It's sexual orientation. So who one is attracted to. It does entail gender, but is not itself gender. So sometimes people confuse being trans with being gay. So when I first came out, people said, "Oh, I didn't know you were gay." When I came out as trans, they're confusing it with being gay. Gay is about sexual orientation. It's about attraction to people. Gender identity or trans is about internal felt sense of one's gender. So they're different things, but I can appreciate why people get confused because we have
Yes.
the LGBT community as a whole, right? So we've got sexual and gender diversity trying to work together towards rights and responsibilities. Yeah.
Last question, really good question came in the Q&A. Where is the pronouns here? Is it based on, and again, let me use this annotate thing that I'm like very proud of using it. Is it based on this?
Yes, so generally it is that people, but I would hesitate. So I know people want to be able to, if they know somebody's pronoun, almost reverse engineer their gender identity.
Yes.
And I caution that, right? Because
Okay.
not everybody is using a pronoun for explicit gender. So there, for example, there are some cisgender people who take on they, them pronouns in addition to their actual pronoun as a solidarity move, right? So they want to make they, them more visible. And so they present multiple pronouns as a way to do that. So you can't always know what somebody's gender is based on their pronouns. So I just caution that, but typically it
check,
is
just
linked
ask.
to people.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, I think I'm done. Thank
Okay.
you.
Excellent. Good clarification. Thank you for sharing your own. Anybody can fill out this spectrum for themselves. You can add the sexual orientation piece at the bottom to continue to deepen that understanding of yourself and others as well. So just a bit of context before we go into some daily kind of challenges that folks face. Some of you may already know that we've got protected grounds against discrimination. Human rights legislation has added gender identity and expression to the existing category of sex. So if you think back to the visual, we've got all three represented within human rights legislation on our provincial and a federal level. That's across Canada, which is really important protections for trans folks. Now, the law is very broad, doesn't state exactly what that means. And so things are clarified in court cases that people submit. So in doing so, we've clarified washroom usage and pronoun usage. In particular, that pronouns are important and intentional misgendering. So using somebody's incorrect pronoun or knowing somebody's pronoun and refusing to use it is actually considered discriminatory through court cases that have gone through recently. And washroom usage has been clarified that it's based on gender identity, not sex. And that clarification for trans people is very key. Because if it was based on sex, I'm going into the women's washroom. If it's based on gender, I'm going into the men's where I belong. So these things have been gone through court cases and been clarified. There's also official government recognition of non-binary gender identities. In particular, various territories and provinces in turquoise have added gender X to driver's licenses, healthcare cards, and also passports on the federal level. And this provides that important recognition. So I just mentioned that in case you encounter, if you're dealing with documentation, that you may encounter gender X on those records. Also important is that most systems are not set up to accept that. So that's another flag for us to consider in thinking about systems and how to receive those official recognitions. So everyday challenges, we're not going to go through all of them, but just give you a very high level overview and then go into specific recent activities that have started. So there's a range of challenges that trans and non-binary folks face, from the more overt, which we started with, the Trans Day of Remembrance. There is a lot of violence against trans people, in particular, trans people of color, or trans women of color, I should say. But then there's also the more subtle varieties of assumptions, jokes, rumors, unmet needs. We have a lot of statistics that show us the kind of the grave situation in which trans people find themselves. Some of those overt challenges are all forms of discrimination, whether they be employment. We see a lot more protesting that's happening recently, unmet health needs, and also in some instances, or many instances still, sadly, family disruption, discord, and difficulties. And it's not just one thing, it's the cumulative impact of so many things bearing down on folks that really can have physical, mental health consequences for folks. So just a few specifics to really give you a sense of just how bad. We have some comparators, trans and non-binary populations to the BC population. This is a Transpulse Canada survey of 3,000 people across Canada and then 500 in BC. And then Statistics Canada for the general population. And we see that there's 3 times as much unemployment, which is quite high. And of course, if you go further into intersectional experiences, trans people of color, trans people with disability, it goes even higher. But this gives you some early insight. We have a lot of disproportionate low income households among trans and non-binary folks, the tune of 3 times as much. And here, really tragically, is unmet health needs. This is both on just general care, but then also gender affirming care, 5 times the rate. It's just, this one bowls me over every single time. Like 50% are not getting their needs met in the healthcare sector currently. There are also subtle challenges. These are day-to-day interactions where, along with the bigger challenges, bear down on folks. And just because something is subtle doesn't necessarily mean that it has low impact. If something is repetitive enough, it can create long-term harm for folks, whether it's jokes, invasive questions, accidental outing, misgendering, and subtle remarks that people make that can, even if not intended, be demeaning towards trans people. Here are some examples of that just to illustrate it. Being incredulous about somebody having multiple pronouns, asking invasive questions about medical transition, thinking that it's surprising to somebody that somebody like a trans woman be beautiful, and or kind of making fun of sharing pronouns by kind of misusing that sharing, and really be focused on looks for how someone in terms of their gender identity. And of course, not surprisingly, these have a negative impact on folks, especially over time, as I mentioned. And we have some stats from various reports that show us just the prevalence of this type of challenge, particularly in the workplace, but also more broadly, that you hear a lot of jokes or negative comments. Majority here we have included stats, not just trans people, but also lesbian, gay, and bisexual folks as well. And inappropriate curiosity as well. So about half of people ask questions that are just going too far. Here are some quotes from folks just to give some texture to those stats, in that people are trying to figure out how to navigate some pretty untenable circumstances, and having to make tough trade-offs to be able to be in a better situation, and taking care of themselves, whether in washroom setting or navigating gossip, and even going to lower paying jobs in order to be able to be their full selves. So this brings us to what's happening recently. And you might have heard on the news, or perhaps even been attending some of the protests that are happening. They're counter protests to what's happening. And essentially, it's a small but very vocal minority of groups that can have some aspect of either religious affiliation, or be concerned or focused on parental rights as a way to target and undo some of the really important progress that's been made to have greater consideration and inclusion of trans and non-binary folks. Particularly, they're focused on trans youth. There's oftentimes that could be a bit of a ground grounds for fighting, because there's a lot of innocence and concern, and there's a lot there to discuss. And so the general public, often if they don't have an understanding of the issue, can kind of not know where to land on the various things that are being discussed. And fortunately, no place like we're doing today to ask questions. So that's why this is so important and why I think it's so commendable that folks at HRX have made this possible. And so, no surprise here, we've got a lot of headlines, talking about the protests and the counter protests and the size of the protests, the numbers across Canada. And, just it can be quite overwhelming to understand what's at play. And so I thought I'd tackle some of the persistent myths about trans people, in particular trans youth or trans children, because that can be quite unsettling for some folks. And we've got lots of data here. We can always try to get original sources to answer these questions and answer them with statistics as well, because I think that helps us get the scale. Because I think sometimes on certain sides, they're blown out of proportion and cause undue fear within people. So the first one, myth, is that children are getting gender affirming surgeries. So either lower or top surgeries, thinking that really young children are getting these. The reality is very different. I will say there are some. They're very, very, very small numbers, and oftentimes for very specific reasons that they're doing it. What actually happens, what is more likely, is that it's a social transition. So when I talked about there are three types of transition: social, medical, and legal, so documents. Kids, for the most part, when they come out as transgender, they're perhaps changing pronouns, their name, and or appearance. So these are all things that are reversible in case that's not the direction they want to go in. So there's not anything permanent, because I think with surgeries, people are thinking about permanence, and that's not the case. If there is a medical piece, it is primarily focused on blockers, but we'll see in the next slide that that's also at a fairly low rate as well. Hormone blockers, I should say, that prevents the puberty from sex assignment. Next myth is that children are getting surgery without parental consent or guardian consent, and that is also not the truth at all. In fact, the reality is that it's really difficult to, if there is a need for surgery, that would be many, many, many hoops to jump through, a lot of medical involvement, psychological assessments, and it does require parental consent. So that it's just not true that kids are getting surgeries without parental consent. The next myth is that being trans is, especially among youth, is a fad or a phase that eventually they'll just grow out of it and it's not to be taken seriously. When actually that is there are higher rates of trans kids coming out, but a lot of that is because now they have an awareness of what that is, and they now can name what's internally happening to them in a way that is really important for their mental health. If they're not able to do that and it's squashed or dismissed, that can actually put them on a very precarious trajectory towards all kinds of really awful health outcomes, sadly. And I'll share some statistics a little bit later on. But the numbers, we do want to acknowledge that there are increase, but it is mainly because of this greater understanding that we have. But they're still low. And I think that's where people, I think they think 50% of youth are now coming out as trans. That's not the case, which we'll show in a second. The next one is that it's easy and cheap, or it's inexpensive to change documents. And actually, that's not the case. It is very laborious process with medical involvement and or psychological involvement. And so as a result, majority of trans folks have not changed their documentation. So it's an important thing to recognize, whether they're youth or not, in a workplace context, not to have that expectation, given some of the bureaucratic challenge related to it. Last one is that I can tell who's trans based on how they look. So we just kind of automatically assume that we'll figure it out, when in fact, actually, a majority say that others do not know they're trans. So we can't rely just on looks in order to know if somebody is transgender. So that helps us figure out a different way of relating and being respectful without having to rely on looks alone. Just a few more stats, just to drive some of the previous realities home. Here's some of the data. This is from a Reuters, mostly from a Reuters article where they called around. This is United States data. We don't have Canadian data, where they called around to all the centers that provide gender affirming care and collected statistics about how many diagnoses there are versus how many people are on blockers and versus how many are getting surgeries. And you can see, number one, there's 2020 data and 2021 data. You can see, first of all, that there are more kids getting diagnosed with dysphoria. Gender dysphoria is the official medical diagnosis, but only 3%, like a really, really low percent of an already low number of people are getting blockers. So hormone blockers to give them more time to think about what they want to do next. It's a time-saving measure. And a thing that I wanted to know too, that most people don't know, is that cisgender youth also, as documented in the yellow, also get hormone blockers. And I think that's lost in the conversation because that's a way to treat precocious puberty, which is when somebody starts their puberty before it's supposed to happen, too early. And they also get hormone blockers. And so we kind of overly focus on trans kids without recognizing that this is a more general approach and is an important tool available to trans and cis youth. And next, you can see top surgeries are actually happening at very low rates. If you think about just the number, thousands of trans youth that there are, very small percentage of them are getting any form of surgery. And compared to that, to how many cisgender youth are getting surgeries. And that's often lost in the conversation as well, is that actually way more cis youth are getting surgery than trans youth. And this is related, mainly it could be breast reduction or augmentation. So it's an important thing to keep in mind as we have this conversation, not to blow the trans stuff out of proportion compared to the cis youth as well. And I will acknowledge that there has been about a 46% increase in the number of diagnoses of gender dysphoria. However, we don't see a corresponding increase in the number of blockers.
Interesting.
So it's really key that we keep the numbers in mind to not blow this out of proportion.
Okay. So let's go back. The last 3 slides is really this whole conversation. Like the name of the webinar is Misconceptions and Addressing These Myths. So these last 3 slides, really everything we wanted, almost everything we wanted to talk about. Of course, Kai will talk about some things we can support our colleagues and people in our community. But let's pause here. A lot of comments, a lot of likes, a lot of questions. I read about this a lot. I work with you, Kai, and I talk to you, and I but still I was like, whoa, this is interesting. Like the cis youth getting the blockers for medical reasons and their numbers compared to trans youth. Like, wow. I like, would be really great if you can take these last 5 minutes, put them in a small WhatsApp video and then share them. You should see how many conversations I had with people telling them, I don't know, these concepts that you have about kids getting surgeries and kids transitioning without their parents or a caregiver approval, and all these myths that are spreading in the community that make people really worried and just initiate that fear. So thank you very much for sharing that. There are a few comments here and there and questions. I'll try to go through some of them. So some of the comments about the social transition, like changing the name, changing the pronoun, and how some kids can ask for that even without the social transition. Do you see or hear about that?
Oh, sorry. Social transition without the medical? Is that the question?
No, they are not coming out, or they are not making a decision about transitioning yet, but they want to change their name, for example, or pronoun.
Yeah, I
The
think
concept of
there's,
exploring, when people say like
yes.
people exploring.
Yeah. And I think it's important to recognize that for some youth that it is an exploration. They want to figure out
Yeah,
what's what and does this resonate? Does this work? Is this where, I find that dis-ease? Is that really going to solve this? And so there should be a place, hopefully at school or somewhere within their friendship circle, where they feel safe enough to be vulnerable to say, hey, I'm trying to figure something out here. Can you call me by this? Use this pronoun and so forth. And that's actually very important, very valuable. I did that
yeah,
myself, but when I was coming out, I was trying to figure it out because we've been programmed to think of ourselves in
yeah.
only one way. And so it takes a bit of unpacking to get to a solid place about what's coming from within. And so I think that's important that kids be able to do that in a safe place. And that can happen where people are just like, I don't know what this means, just trying to figure
Great.
it out.
Thank you. Thank you. No, that's great. Another comment about these systems, the colonial systems, and how they make it really hard, the need to change your legal documents, the need to fight all these systems to transition. And I totally agree with that. I think a lot of our systems are like this or that, black or white, right or wrong. And we
Mm,
we didn't really get this like perspective that there is like a range of things and we need to be like really more empathetic and supportive, which is really important. Um, one comment about how this information is important, but this is not what's shared in mainstream media. It's not money making info. Agree. I totally agree. I think what makes
mm,
money for these channels is people clicking and being like
mm.
fearful and fighting and going out and protesting. And unfortunately, that's the reality. Um, and then there was one comment here that I thought, oh, there's so many questions. There's a comment about what we can do. So that's what Kai will be talking about. So that's really great, really great. Okay, I think I'm good for now, and I'll keep monitoring the Q&A.
Okay, excellent. And I'm so excited by all the fantastic questions and considerations. And it is very complex. And you're right, the media generally doesn't have, the will to go into nuance and really explain things in a way that help people understand and really just about outrage. So in terms of everyday intervention, so now that we know the problems, of course, that does beg the question, what do we do about it? What can I do as an individual? I think it's important to recognize our position and our degree of influence. Obviously, we have the most control over ourselves. And then, with concentric circles outside of ourselves, the people we are with every day, family and friends. Of course, we go to work, perhaps, or part of a community. And then, we might have political sway, or maybe even we're operating on a global level. But for some, it might just be the first two, maybe even just yourself, right? So just locating your level of influence will help you create a sustainable change over time. And of course, there's also types of influence as well, or interventions that we can take. And certainly, I do think it's really important for things like protests or engagements and signs external. But I think it's really important also to have the sustained pieces so we can create a strong cedar that will grow and have deep roots. So, it's important for the visible signs. But I think also to those everyday actions that seem maybe simple or small, but that actually do over the long term create much sustained change, especially if a lot of people are doing them. So just encourage you to think about the types of interventions and making sure that we don't overdo it on one side or the other of the kind of special efforts versus the everyday ones. Today's focus is on the more everyday pieces. Of course, definitely going to protests can be an important part of pushing back on some of that. I know that the media is very good about documenting how many people were on each side of the protests, right? The protests with the religious groups and or the parental rights, they were outnumbered in many instances by the counter protests for supporting trans and non-binary folks. So that was really important. But sometimes the more subtle or everyday ones are perhaps less known or maybe not as familiar to folks. And certainly, if we have, if we know somebody's first name and pronouns and they give those to us from trans folks, then it's really important to respect those. It's almost irrespective of what's on a government issued ID, especially recognizing that it is challenging and colonial and deeply problematic. And so just really focusing on what people share without having to have that kind of official support or backing for that. Important not to assume people's pronouns. So we do this a lot where we look at somebody. If they're feminine, we use she, her pronouns. If they're masculine looking, we use he, him pronouns. Maybe first name is in the mix too, which can sometimes have gender in it. And so it's not assuming. Really, a powerful practice is to exchange pronouns or at least model it. You can say, I'll give my example. When I introduce myself, I say, I'm Kai, I use he, him pronouns, and I'm president of Transfocus Consulting. And so somebody might pick up on that and then respond in kind with theirs. But again, we're not forcing people to provide their pronouns, but just providing space if they wish to do so. And sometimes you might be curious about somebody. Maybe there's a trans person you're getting to know and you kind of want to really get into all of their story and history and how they came to understand and what's happening. But just kind of reflecting a little bit before you jump into that is to say, would I ask this of a cis person? Am I reading where they're at? Are they feeling uncomfortable by this line of inquiry? And maybe you want to tell a joke, but you don't know if it's appropriate. You can kind of ask, would you tell this joke if a trans person was in the room, if you don't know somebody is there? Really important, especially for as much as there's disempowerment through systems and different things that are at play that people experience, is to re-empower folks by giving them the freedom to show up as little or as much as they would like. So we're really putting them in the driver's seat and following their lead. And then if you do want to know more about things, there's tons of really great many resources out there and things where you can get those answers for yourself, whether it's going on a YouTube channel to hear more about stories or diving deeper into the research that we've presented here today. You can also, be a part of your own education without overloading just one person for that information. And it's not to say curiosity is a bad thing. I think it's actually a good thing, but it's just misplaced in certain circumstances. So you can model that for others by doing it yourself, which is very powerful. And then one thing in doing that, if you do that yourself, you can have impact on trans youth if you're if you know a trans youth by just being that one supportive adult in the room that allows them to be themselves. And we have statistics that show us that if there's just one adult, doesn't have to be a parent or anybody, they're 4 times more likely to have good outcomes, whether it's depressive symptoms are reduced drastically or people consider less suicide or actually attempt less. That's just the supportive adults play such a huge role, and you could be that one if you have a trans youth in your midst. And then how to intervene with others. So you might not be doing the challenging things, but you might see others doing that, in which case you can respond in the moment by pushing back, especially if it's like a joke or disparaging comment. You can share what you've learned here today. And without shaming or blaming, you can say, hey, did you know? This is what's actually going on. You might hear this, but actually this is happening. And also explaining and unpacking things. I generally tend to favor private conversations, one-on-one or a small group, where you can really get into what's underneath their concerns to get them the information they need. And then, of course, you can share your understanding on the topic and provide resources for folks to and relearn on the topic. And I'm curious to hear any other interventions. There's so many more, of course. So if you want to share others that you do on a daily basis or common basis, feel free to share those here. I'll just see if I have any other things. One last comment before we go to questions is, the people in terms of adopting change on the topic of gender diversity or more broadly, there's a bell curve. So there's people who come very easily. You can collaborate with those, partner with them, ally with them. There's others who are a little bit later to the game, in which case you can have an educational role with them. And then there's always going to be a small percentage of folks who are just not going to come. And I tend to say, ignore them. I know other people recommend to push back on them. Whichever way you go, I think it's important to recognize that maybe they might not come along. And depending on how much energy you have to figure out how you apply that. And here's a few other things. If you see something, say something, especially when it comes to a structural challenge that you encounter. And it's about your own journey. Others might join you. Leadership could or could not be along the way, but it doesn't mean that you can't do something. So I'll wrap it up from there in the interest of time and taking some additional questions.
I think we are good, to be honest with you. A lot of the comments are just people appreciating this. I am on mute, but I'm like, wow. You can hear me, Kai. Like, just like being the only supportive, like the person who's supportive in a meeting or like in an interaction. It just like means so much for people. And I didn't really appreciate that. You're reducing the risk for depression, for suicide. So just be that person, that circle of influence. Just take that with you all. And it's really, really fascinating and powerful. I see a lot of great comments. People really appreciate your openness, your honesty, your just approach, Kai. I think that's why I like Kai a lot, people. All of you. Jay, can you go back to that, like the curve where people?
Oh yeah, that's so one of my favorite.
Look how many people you can engage and bring, by just education and collaboration. Look at that. Like just fascinating, right? So people just think about that, really think about how, like, the opportunity versus us focusing on a small group of people that we spend so much money and energy and power and exhaustion. There's a lot of opportunity. So let's really focus and think about that. I think we are done. Do you want to close with anything? I know that you have some resources and things you want people to go through quickly.
Oh yeah.
For Transfocus, yes, please do that.
Yeah, we have a series if you want to go further into gender diversity. There's a few different topics that we cover. Obviously, it's focused on the workplace, so we do know some things about youth, but and we brought that into this session just to dispel some of the myths. But we have a lot of great information across a series of 4 sessions, and would also welcome any feedback on today's session in case you want to provide pointers or any thoughts in addition to what we present. But yeah, thank you very much. It's been a pure pleasure, and look to continue the dialogue with folks. But yeah, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Kai. I'll just remind people, please, check our website, HRX, and also Transfocus. We have the webinars. If you allow me to share my slide, thank you, Kai. So I'll share this for you if you want to get access to those. So here's the QR code. You get very similar webinars like this one that me and Kai are facilitating. We are partnering with a lot of really great, partners that we know and respect and work with them around racial identity, transgender, Pride Month, Truth and Reconciliation, Women's International Day. So click on that and just share that with your, with your team, with your management, and just encourage them to participate. Sign up for our December 6th webinar with Shalima and Sarah about inclusive holidays. Would be great conversation, really good timing before, December and end of the year and all these questions about holidays. So sign up for that. And then go to our website. I really encourage you to follow our LinkedIn page. Here's the QR code. Just click that and join our LinkedIn. We post about, our resources, our webinars, our events, and a lot of opportunities. So do that. If you have any questions, reach out to Kai, invest in this topic, reach out to us, please email us and learn and spread the learning. There's a lot of power we can really help each other to educate and collaborate. So thank you, Kai, and thank you everyone for joining. Take care, everyone. Beautiful comments, huh?